All right, so we're going to continue our chapter 4, lesson 2. So I apologize I can't be here today, but this is my best way of being able to support you and give you the notes that you need and explain what we're talking about. So therefore, on Monday, since this is also going to be a short section in our book, you can plan on having the class period to do your assignment. So make sure you are on page 143, that you highlight and take notes as I go through this section. So as we begin to look at animals, then we want to be able to recognize if they're animals or not. And our first question is going to be very similar to what we had when it came to plants. How do I know it's a plant? Well, the first thing I notice is that it had a cell. Now, as we will see a little later on in our chapter, that the animal cells are different from plant cells. They have several things that are the same, but if you hopefully remember on your last test, then I had asked you, what are the two main things that are different about plant cells compared to animal cells. But it's just the idea that all animals are going to have cells. That's where we begin to confirm that it is a cell. And then we start looking at other things that it has. So as we said, just in the same way that plants are designed, when cells doing the same job come together, they make tissue. So here I have an image of muscle cells. And then when several muscle cells come together, they're going to make muscle tissue. Now when muscle tissue all comes together, they make up an organ. So when I look at animals, we have three main categories. We have, yes, it has cells, and those cells come together to make tissue, and then that tissue comes together and makes a designed organ. Now in this particular image, then I have the bicep and the tricep of the human, right? Now, not all organs or organisms, excuse me, that are animals are going to have a bicep and a tricep. But hopefully you're understanding what I'm saying is that they have a designed organ that is made up of tissue, that tissue is made up of cells. That's really where this book is going to cover the basic information. However, my goal is still to be able to get to health. And as I mentioned on the plant PowerPoints and in class, we have two more steps of organization here, because when we get into the health standards, then we see that when I have multiple organs, like all of the muscles coming together, then I have an organ system. This is the muscular system of the human being. And then when we talk about how all organ systems come together, so in our body we have the muscular system, we have the skeletal system that the muscles are attached to, we have the digestive system, the circulatory system, the respiratory system, epithelial system. So when all of those things come together, we end up with an organism. Now, before I continue on, please, as a reminder, be taking notes in your book, highlighting if it's in the print, writing in the margins if it's not. So as we're defining an animal and looking at an animal and recognizing it as an animal, then I need to know what a cell is. And a cell, once again, is the very basic unit of measurement when it comes to a living organism. Unicellular, it's only going to be one cell. If it's a multicellular, then we know that organism has multiple different types of cells as well as multiple cells. So once again, I have a group of muscle cells. And when those muscle cells then come together, then they're going to make tissue. So the definition you need to know for tissue is that that's a group of cells, similar cells, that perform a specific job. When I have multiple muscle cells, they're going to be coming together to help do the job of a muscle. All right, so then we think, well, when they come together to do the job of a muscle, then I know when all that tissue comes together, they create the designed organ. So a designed organ is a specific set of tissues that make a particular organ or a particular item. So once again, I have the bicep and tricep. So I have striated muscle cells, I have striated muscle tissue, and all of the striated muscle tissue will come together to make the bicep. Will come together to make the tricep. So those are very specifically designed organs. Continuing on into our health topic though, just so you can recognize what an organ system is, it is a group of organs that are all designed to do the same type of job. So all of the muscles, you have over 600 muscles in your body that come together to make up the organ system. And an organism is all of the organ systems working together to make up one living thing. All right, so when I look at that then, and I can see and look at the animal, it has cells, and then I begin to look at, well, does it have symmetry? So in math, we think about symmetry, and we usually think about a vertical or a horizontal symmetry, which just simply means that I can divide it and see that I have the same thing on both sides, right? Like a butterfly. I have bilateral symmetry, which means I can divide it up and down. It could be, horizontally, but that wouldn't be a bilateral dissection for this particular organism. But it means that there's one line that I can draw, and the left and the right, or the top and the bottom, is going to look the same. The butterfly can be divided down the middle, and it's going to look the same. Now, it doesn't mean if there would be a scar on one side that there's going to be a scar on the other. If there's an injury on one side, the injury has to be on the other. Hopefully you're understanding what I mean by it would be the same on both sides. But when it comes to animals, I have a couple other types of symmetry. So radial symmetry means that there are multiple ways that I can divide the organism that it will be the same. Right? So if you notice the sea star, that you can see that there are multiple different ways that we can divide that sea star that both sides are going to be the same. When I get into asymmetry, living organisms, there isn't any way I could divide things like a sea sponge or this coral that's in this picture, and it's going to be the same, right? They just grow in all sorts of different directions. So asymmetry, there are no lines of symmetry at all. Radial symmetry, there's multiple lines of symmetry. Bilateral, that's the one we often think about when we think about the common organisms that we see. There's one line, it can be divided in half, and it's the same on two sides. Once again, bi means two, lateral means basically a line. So then your book gives you these three images, and it just wants to make sure that you understand which is which. So when I look at the starfish, now we're used to a five-pointed star, aren't we? But that's not 5 points. So one of the things that people don't realize that on a starfish or a sea star, there's all sorts of different kinds. There are some that have 5, some that have 6, some that have like 10 legs. There's brittle stars and things like that, and we'll get more into that a little later in our book. But this is a sea star or starfish. And when I start looking at it and I'll see multiple lines of symmetry, then I hopefully can recognize that that is radial symmetry. There in the middle, then I have coral and sponge growing together. There are not two sides anywhere that I can divide, and it's going to be the same, so that it would be asymmetrical. And then we have a basic fiddler crab, and we can see that, if I divide that straight down the middle, top to bottom, I've got eyes on both sides, I've got pinchers on both sides, I've got 4 legs on both sides, right? It's definitely a bilateral symmetry. So when I start looking at how that symmetry is designed, then I start noticing some things. So I'm going to start with the idea of the asymmetrical. When I look at asymmetrical organisms, those organisms are going to always be just simple cells and very simple structures, right? A sponge doesn't have a mouth, it doesn't have eyes, right? It has, openings, it filters in what's called marine snow and cleans the water for us, but it doesn't have any majorly developed organ systems. Radial symmetry, because there's multiple ways to divide it then, it's going to have some structures, but not as many complicated organ and designed organs and organ systems as the bilateral. So it's still going to have the cells, and it's going to have tissue structures, and it's going to have some organs, but it's not going to have as many and as highly developed as the bilateral. So the bilateral symmetry is always going to be the multiple complex organs and organ systems. It's going to have higher sensory organs like a nose for smelling and a mouth for tasting, and then ways to feel and eyes to see. The other groupings, they don't have all those extra things. So when we begin to see ourselves as humans as bilateral symmetry, then we can see the benefit of having bilateral symmetry, right? When you have asymmetrical symmetry, you don't have those highly developed organs that allow you to do a lot of higher level of thinking, feeling, seeing, tasting, smelling. When you have, radial symmetry, you have some of those sensory organs, but not very many. But bilateral, we've got eyes to see and a nose to smell and a mouth to taste, and we have feelings and we have appendages, and it's the whole idea that the fewer lines of symmetry you have, the more highly developed your brain becomes. And if you ever have seen an image of a brain, then you also understand that that brain has a bilateral symmetry. You have a right side of your brain and a left side of your brain. So the fewer lines of symmetry, the more highly developed it is. So when I look at that, if I think about a sea star and I think about a fish and I think about their symmetry, right? Well, are they animals? Yes. So we do have some things in common, right? They're definitely animals. What else do they have in common? They live in water, right? Both of them live in water. Well, they have cells. We could include that as well. They have some organs and organ systems. Well, let's look at how they're different. So let's look at their symmetry. So we already said that a sea star is radial symmetry, right? There's multiple ways we can divide it, and it would look the same on both sides. When I look at the fish, though, I can cut it right down the center, and I have bilateral symmetry. Right? There's eyes on both sides. I can cut the tongue right down the middle. It does have a small brain, but it is a developed brain, and it can be split in half. And I've got fins on both sides, and I've got that bilateral symmetry. When I look at the sea star and how it gets around, it only gets around by crawling. It can't swim. It doesn't have a way to balance itself. Right? It just feels as it's moving along. To where the fish, it has the ability to swim because it can see where it's going. It has more highly developed eyes, but it's the fins, it's the appendages that will move and allow it to sail through the water because it's got the fins on top, the bottom, the sides, and the tail that help it get around. When I look at the sea star, then it doesn't have a head, right? It does have eyes, and a lot of people don't realize that, but sea stars have eyes at the end of each of their legs. So when I look at their eyes, though, they can only detect light and then some outlines of different shapes. They don't have highly developed eyes, right? And if you try to imagine looking in 5 different ways, or even up to 10 if it's got multiple arms, how confusing would that be for your brain to try to figure out where it's looking? When it comes to a mouth, well, it does have an opening that we would call a mouth, but really what it is an opening, and the stomach basically turns itself inside out and digests the organs that it's eating. It doesn't have a nose. It doesn't have a way to smell. So without a head, it doesn't have those higher developed organs and organ systems like a bilateral organism does, right? The fish has a head. Not only does it have a head, it has developed eyes. It can see from the right and it can see from the left. It can see when a predator is approaching. Right? It does have a mouth, and that mouth is designed for tasting, and that mouth will have teeth, and it'll have a jaw, a mandible, and it'll move. And it does have what we would call a nose on a fish. Now, they don't actually have a nose like you and I do, right? But they do have nostrils, and a fish has a very high sense of smell in the water. And that's very key for them because they can detect predators, but also detect the food that they're looking for. So, we have some similarities, but there's a lot of major differences between a radial symmetry organism compared to a bilateral symmetry organism. All right, so it's a quick lesson, right? But make sure that you go back and get all the notes that I covered, highlight them or write them in your book. But we're going to finish with these 2 questions. All right, so what is an advantage to bilateral symmetry? And hopefully you know that if you have bilateral symmetry, then you're usually talking about a head and highly developed sensory organs. Right? 1B is, how do you know something is an animal? But we go back to that original section that we started on. We have three major things we're looking for when it's an animal. Right? It has cells, it has tissues, and it has designed organs. Now, it could be as simple as a sponge, right, that doesn't move, doesn't have sensory organs like eyes and mouth and all that, but it still has cells, it still has tissues, and it still has organs. So it's still an animal, right? And we could look at ourselves, and we definitely have cells, tissues, and organs. All right, so that's the entire section, and I know it's quick, and I talk fast, but I didn't want it to take too long. But go back and watch and get all the notes that I wrote down, because you are going to have a test over chapter 4. And then the rest of the time in class, just work quietly and stay in your seats and not give the sub any problems. And then on our next day of class, you'll be able to do your assignment.